In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
My car keys dangle on a key ring with about 10 other keys. That's 11 different doors. 11 different doors to cars, buildings, houses, rooms, and boxes. There's something comforting about spaces that we can secure. Doors and keys ensure that particular places are only accessible by particular people. Most house doors even have a small peephole, windows where we can see who's knocking at our door. We like to know before we let them in. Is it our neighbor, the plumber, a persistent salesman, a Girl Scout, or maybe an intruder? In today's passage, Jesus didn't knock. He didn't ask to be let in. He didn't send the disciples a text asking them to come on outside. All John tells us is that suddenly the risen Lord is among the disciples who are hiding behind locked doors. Seems that the security that the disciples craved wasn't very effective. So too, Jesus comes through the doors that we also hide behind. Sometimes he comes unexpected, at times uninvited, and even unwelcome. Jesus came and stood among the frightened disciples, announcing peace in the midst of anxiety and fear. The man that they had committed their lives to following had died, and they were overcome with anxiety. What would the future look like now? How could they go on in a world where Jesus lay in a tomb? Fears can at times overwhelm us too. There are moments when the dread creeps in and we find ourselves unable to move, unwilling to find the courage or the strength or motivation to leave our own self-imposed tombs. The disciples thought what they needed most was security, but it was not the comfort of a fortified room that they needed, but the announcement of resurrection peace. We find that Jesus offers to those that he loves what they need most. And often this takes us by surprise. We're also told in today's text that Thomas wasn't among the disciples hiding in the room. Maybe he wasn't scared. Maybe he went out to get a cup of coffee and returned to them with this crazy story about a risen Lord. The other disciples tell Thomas that Jesus is risen, but Thomas is skeptical. We all know Thomas's real first name, Doubting Thomas. History hasn't been so kind. In fact, Doubting Thomas has his own Wikipedia page. He has an entry in Merriam-Webster. There are lots of blogs written. Thomas finds himself unable to get rid of this pesky adjective, doubting. But actually, Thomas is not the first to doubt the risen Lord. Last week we proclaimed the resurrection. The stone was found rolled away from the tomb. But in today's text, we find Jesus strolling through locked doors. Now, if Jesus is walking through locked doors, why was the stone rolled away? Seems a bit counterintuitive. Did Jesus need the entrance of the tomb opened in order for him to leave? Surely not. But why didn't he just walk through the stone? Why bother rolling it away? Perhaps the stone was rolled away not so that Jesus could walk out of the tomb, but so that Mary Magdalene might glimpse the resurrection hope. The stone was removed not so that Christ might walk away, but so that Mary might walk away from her grief and despair. She approaches the tomb from a distance, sees the light pouring into the opening, the stone is gone. But in John's account, only a few verses before today's text, she doesn't see the empty tomb and respond with hope and joy. Instead, she starts sobbing, believing that someone has stolen Jesus' body. Mary didn't believe that Jesus was risen. She thought his body had been taken. She doubts the possibility of resurrection. Jesus cries out and calls her by name, Mary. Her name is offered so that she might come to believe. We're told that Mary goes away from the presence of Christ announcing the good news. But the disciples are scared and crouching behind padlocks and deadbolts. We're not told particularly how they respond to Mary, but they do continue to hide even after hearing the good news. The disciples' belief is also riddled with doubt. And so Jesus outstretches his broken and resurrected body so that Thomas might outstretch his own arm and feel the scars that bind the pain and resurrection together. Truly, this is not a story about doubting Thomas, the doubting disciples, or doubting Mary. No, the crux of this story is the risen Christ who offers himself. It isn't Thomas grazing his fingers along Jesus' palms that leads him to confess, "My Lord and my God." No, it's Christ offering his body that envelops Thomas in belief. Mary mistakes the hope of a rolled away stone for a crime scene. And likewise, we don't always recognize the small instances of God's faithfulness in our own lives. Or maybe we lock ourselves away from God, away from others. Our key rings are heavy with security and fear, grief and doubt. Or maybe our faith wavers and we insist on feeling the very wounds that we inflict on another. We're as human as the disciples, as Mary and Thomas. But Christ offers what we need most. Our name is called out. God's Spirit is breathed upon us. Hope is offered in moments of despair. Peace is announced when we're anxious. And Christ's wounded body is graciously offered to each of us. Jesus blesses those who have not seen and believe. But Jesus still opens his hands so that Thomas might feel them, that Thomas might believe. Surely that is also a blessing. We find that Jesus cares more that Thomas comes to believe than the manner by which Thomas actually has this new faith. Christ continues to be offered to us in the body and blood of the Eucharist, in the body of another who offers a warm embrace. The grace of peace announced in a world of violence and fear. In the sound of our name called by one who loves us. And the Spirit of God breathed on us so that we might go out and announce the good news. Jesus rolls away stones, passes through locked doors, offers his very wounds so that we might believe. We're told that this is the purpose of John's gospel, our belief. This movement from darkness to light, from disbelief to belief, from the cross to an empty tomb to a locked room and a wounded, risen body. Faith, it seems, is often birthed out of the most unlikely of spaces. Moments of deep despair and grief, locked rooms where we tremble in fear, moments where we are uncertain and hesitant. My parents experienced a rather unusual Easter weekend this year. A good family friend of ours, Joe Ward, passed away, and his memorial service was held on Holy Saturday. Apparently, the memorial service was held in the morning because on the afternoon of Holy Saturday, the church hosted a community-wide Easter egg hunt. My dad, when I called him, described the scene. Everybody arriving to the church. They parked near a field that was partitioned off with banners and balloons and streamers. Candy-filled Easter eggs were strewn across the lawn, speckling the grass. There was a table set up for hot dogs and hamburgers later. Meanwhile, my parents filed into the other side of the sanctuary with a lot of darkly clad adults. Joe was a big man. He was a carpenter, a gardener, a poet, a wonderful cook, and a storyteller. He had this booming voice and really rough, large hands. And I normally saw him in overalls. My parents recall that the sanctuary that morning was filled with laughter as family members told different stories of Joe. Joe would often work in the nursery at the church he attended, and he loved the little children, all the toddlers, but he couldn't remember most of their names, so he just called them all Fred. And so he would call to them and say, "Fred, come to your Uncle Joe," when they were upset. After the service, the pastor apologized to everyone for all of the crazy Easter events that were going on around the service. The pastor said that it was the only funeral he'd been to where you could take a pony ride immediately after the funeral was over. I laughed when my parents described the scene. It seemed absurd. But I can't imagine a more perfect setting for Joe's funeral. A funeral transformed into an Easter egg hunt for excited children. A moment of grief, fear, and disbelief transformed into an event of joy, laughter, and new life. Of course, this is the story of the resurrection. This news disrupts us and the doors that we tend to hide behind. It surprises us and seems absurd. The tomb becomes the womb of new life. Death is transformed into resurrection hope. Christ is no longer in the tomb, but Christ does enter into our own tombs, unexpected, uninvited, and even unwelcome. The willing Lord meets us where we are. And we find that these spaces of fear, of doubt, and despair are transformed into belief and hope. Amen.
Amen.